episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show with another fascinating guest who is involved in creating a better tomorrow for all of us. And on tonight's show, we are going to be headed back into the area of longevity, healthy aging, and a variety of related themes. And we have the honor tonight of being joined by Michael Antonov, who is the founder and CEO of the Michael Antonov Foundation, which is a charitable organization that supports biotech research and various causes that improve well-being of people around the world. He's also the founder of Formic Ventures, which is an early-stage high-tech and biotech investment firm focused on prolonging human health span and empowering human creativity. Michael is a serial entrepreneur and philanthropist. He's passionate about taking on huge challenges that can make a difference in human lives, including solving the problem of aging. Prior to launching the foundation, Michael was a tech executive, and most recently he was the co-founder and chief software architect at Oculus, which was subsequently acquired by Facebook, where he helped revive the virtual reality industry. Prior to that, Michael was the co-founder and chief technology officer of Scaleform, which is a user interface software company whose product is embedded into hundreds of computers, consoles, and mobile games all around the world. Michael is a graduate of University of Maryland in computer science, and he is a member of their Alumni Hall of Fame. Michael Antonov, thank you for taking the time to come on the show today and talk to us a little bit.
Thank you so much, Ari. It's a pleasure to meet it. Yes, I've actually gotten excited about longevity maybe about 5 years ago. But before that, a big part of my career really had to do with software. So it's sort of almost two separate parts of my life. First part was kind of programming, gaming technology, and I'll talk about that a bit, including Oculus and virtual reality. And then last 5 years is when I really kind of started to learn more and more about biology and got super excited about it, which is what I'm doing now.
Outstanding. So, take us back to the beginning. So take us back from the beginning, when sort of where you grew up, how you got interested in software and programming, and take us up until sort of 5 years ago. I think that'd be a great way to start everything out so people can really learn more about you.
Well, you could probably tell a little bit from my accent that I'm actually of the Russian background. So my family brought me here when I was 14 years old. So this was early 90s. So I come from kind of couple years after the kind of perestroika and all the changes. And I immigrated with my stepdad and my mom and kind of ended up in this new country, going to actually high school in America. And at the time, everything was pretty new. And one of the things which I got very excited about basically in high school was programming. And that kind of would set the path for most of my life for up till recent point. And at the time, we had these graphing programming calculators. In math, you could actually plot a graph, and they had a programming language. Mine was Texas Instruments TI-85. And there were little statements, kind of like BASIC, where you could tell it to draw a line, draw a curve, or whatever, and you could get some input from a keyboard. So I would just sit there for many hours during classes. And so usually more math, because that's when you were allowed to use a calculator. And I would program games and things. I made Tetris as one of my first just fun exercises. And that's really got me into computers. And then it actually took my family a while to get a computer for me. My grandmother helped me a bit, and I have a very fond memory of her for that, because we didn't have much money, so it was a big purchase. But I ended up sitting and programming for a long time, late nights up until college. So that was basically my early years. And I learned assembly language. I programmed in C, made graphics, games, and played a little bit of games, kind of the old, like I remember the Wolfenstein days. That's kind of the time. After that, I ended up going to University of Maryland for software programming engineering. And that's when actually my path kind of started being extra interesting, I would say. And that's because that's when I met my future business partner, Brendan. And he was much more energetic guy than me. Brendan would ultimately be the CEO of Oculus, and he was one of the other co-founders. So this relationship started 20 years in that past. And I was by then trying to make games. I would program. I wanted to make a game studio so you can create tools. And he also had background in it. So we naturally came together and started this company. Ultimately, it was called Scaleform. And what it really was is two of us and a couple of other friends sitting in like our version of a garage was actually an old bank. There were literally like wires hanging from the ceiling. And we rented it for like $300 or $400 a month. But we sat there programming, and ultimately we made a product called Scaleform, which was a user interface solution. So if you play a game, let's say Crisis or Mass Effect, there's menus which show up. And there's animations, it tells you what your score is, if you get hit, maps, directions, any kind of text on screen, animations and textures. So we made technology which made that possible. And it was a struggle, frankly, up until first 5 years, we had no, like our product was very weak. We had a few investors who stopped giving us money, start giving us money. But ultimately, we made that tool and few people started picking up, and it ended up being a pretty good, I'm actually proud for a lot of the work there around vector graphics and user interface tech, which was shipped in many games. And ultimately, that company exited to Autodesk. We had about 30 employees, and it really gave us lots of experience within the gaming industry so we could head on to Oculus.
Keep going, please.
Well, the Oculus story is really where it got exciting, because the biggest difference was the first company was a decade of work. This is basically us sitting with no money up until last 3 years were successful. And I did part-time college, and Oculus started actually with this young guy, Paul Merlecki, who made a handmade foam core headset. And this headset had duct tape, and it took these lenses from basically a magnifying glass and screen from a phone, and was able to connect it so you could have a 3D image. And at the time, what happened is he partnered and gave his headset to well-known programmer John Carmack at E3, and he demonstrated this thing which lots of people started writing about. This was E3 2012. So my friend Brendan, who we did the first company together, reached out to Palmer and said, like, let's talk about this. Could this be a company? So, and he is always very like a risk taker when he sees something he really believes in. And I usually jump in to make it work with him. So literally a week later, it was summer of 2012. We sit down with Palmer, and he shows us a headset. The headset, literally, I remember taking it because it had like wires and boards, and you put it in front of a screen. This is just like this handmade thing. But inside was a 3D image. And the cool thing about it is you could move around your head, and everything was in the right place and had a sense of scale. So it was very compelling. And you can even like look down, and sometimes if it was like a big fall off, you'd like lean back. So that was the moment when I was like, oh my God, people are gonna want this. This is exciting to work on. And we ended up starting a company. So that's pulled me in. And then Palmer wanted to do a Kickstarter. Crowdsourced. I actually haven't heard about Kickstarter back then. We made this produced video, and I could not believe actually so many people would get excited about it. Like, we had a goal of $250,000 to kick off the project, which meant we'd have to basically send these kits to several hundred people. And the first day at launch, it exploded, and people started talking about it on Reddit. So we had over $1 million worth of orders on the first day. It closed in 2 and a half, which was like, oh my God. And we just sitting there watching, okay, now we have to really set up manufacturing and make it all work. So that's really what launched the company. And I was on a hook then to ship the game developers kit for it.
Okay.
So the SDK. So basically you have a hardware piece which displays it, you have the graphics, like on the computer you have a GPU which renders the 3D world, but somehow you got to make sure that your image is in stereo, it's all 3D, and if you look right and left and up and down, all the world is in the right place. So my job as basically a chief software architect and co-founder in Oculus was to make that work. And quite honestly, in the beginning, I didn't know how to make it work. I had to learn a lot of like tracking, gyroscopes, accelerometers, what's called sensor fusion, and put together the team for graphics, because you work with game engines such as Unreal, like very popular in the game industry. They have these beautiful renderings they could do, and games use it so that they can make the rest of the scenery. So there's artists who make the content, but then there's these engines in the back. So my job and our team's job was really to make all this sensor data and rendering work while combined with an engine and the game. So that was incredible. And I think it was one of the best parts of my life. And we ended up solving a few interesting problems. One was simply displaying it so it's in real time. That's what made Oculus successful. If you put it together, look around, everything is in the right place. One of them was orientation tracking, but the second problem was actually something called positional tracking. And this is, if you just have a gyroscope, it tells you the orientation. So you can look around, but if you are moving in space, your body shifts to the right or say to the left, then the world would kind of drag with you. And some people would get dizzy and it just doesn't feel right. So one of the biggest challenges we had to solve was actually a computer vision problem of how do you track this? And our solution was to take a camera which looks at the headset and have these LEDs inside of it and really track it. So this was my kind of like project where I brought some really smart people to work with, and it was incredible. We got like just the people on the team just kept getting better and better. John Carmack, creator of Doom, joined us about a year into the project. And he worked more on the module technology. And that's what kind of made it all come together, ultimately to become a part of Facebook, which I didn't quite anticipate, but that's really got the industry started. So it was an incredible journey.
Definitely. And there's so many parts of that I'd like to go into, especially the positional tracking stuff later on, because there's some really interesting analogies there. But I'd love to hear now, going back now 5 years, as you were saying, and it's interesting because I talk to different people on this show that, have had that moment too, whether it's aging or whether it's some other health, and they're never people from the healthcare industry, strangely enough. I did something with a group that Bernie Marcus from the Home Depot decided to get involved in, obviously the Calico folks based on Google, Michael Antonov, virtual reality, software, Facebook, and tell us why longevity now. What clicked that this is my next thing I'm going to conquer?
So what happened was once we became a part of Facebook, we actually had to work there for quite a few years. That was just kind of a part of the deal because the product was very young. So I ended up working on web VR, and I still led part of the PC tracking team, but I had a bit more time. And we actually moved to San Francisco then. And kind of about a year later, I ended up meeting Aubrey de Grey. And you might know him from the industry. He's a really huge enthusiast. Yep. And we ended up actually presenting, I think at some of the same small event. I talked about VR, he talked about longevity. And I ended up reaching out to him and actually reading his book called Ending Aging. And in this book, he kind of breaks down what happens in your body in an organized way. He talks about mitochondrial damage, how you have less energy. It talks about basically different damaged proteins, intracellular, extracellular damage. And it was a way for me to kind of get introduced to this in an organized fashion. And I started thinking, well, where are we in this whole aging thing? Can we actually do something about it, like in our lifetime? And I ended up going to a conference called Undoing Aging in Berlin. And it's pretty awesome. And there's two things they do there. They have scientific presentations where there's basically real science in detail. And then you have some more higher level and like startup presentations as well, where somebody might have a project that could impact longevity. So I got very excited because I saw how specific areas of kind of biological damage what's happening in the body could be addressed. So it really pulled me in, and it was like I started digging. I saw the videos of Drew Barry of this molecular machinery, and if you guys haven't seen it, I totally recommend them. They're incredible. So there's literally almost like this mechanical looking process where you have these proteins walking down the microtubules, and then the other one I think is ATP synthase, which is this energy molecule of the body which are made, and there's literally this spinning structure where protons fly out and it changes the molecule so it can stitch on as an extra phosphate group. Anyway, that's how your energy is made in the mitochondria. Sure. But to me, that was like, oh my God, can be understood. We already know a lot about it. So I got pulled in to the point as well, maybe I should start investing in this space. Maybe I should learn about this. And I met some great people also. One of my good friends now, Alex Javrankov, he is the CEO of in-silico medicine. Mm-hmm. He's one of the most driven people who really believes in longevity. He is about the same age as me, and his life mission is to move this field forward. So I really got inspired, and kind of to the point of taking classes. So one thing I realized is I know nothing about this field. This is completely new, and it's huge. So I like to kind of pick up the basics. So I literally signed up for evening classes. I went to Berkeley Extensions here nearby. So I would drive to Facebook, do my full work, and then on the way back, there's like 4:30 class till 10:30 or till 10 maybe. I stayed and I did organic chemistry, I did biochemistry. Just recently, now sadly it's online, I finished immunology. So I've started picking up kind of the basic science. And in the meantime, also learning, going to investing events, and getting more and more excited. And I think the real reason I kind of decided to make it a bigger part of my life is that I got the sense that we're at a point in history where we have a technology both around kind of tooling and biochemical understanding and AI and machine learning, that the tools we have are coming together that we can actually understand the details of biology. And a very simple classical example is how people talk about the Human Genome Project, how it basically was hundreds of millions of dollars to sequence the genome, and to some, and now it's hundreds, and it's becoming cheaper. So that those DNA tools actually provide you a lot more information. Like you can study epigenetics now, what are the genes are expressed. You can study how basically these chromosomes are wrapped, like chromatin, and how proteins bind. There's so much extra stuff you get from those tools rather than just DNA sequence. And so you get this huge amount of data. So we're talking about gigabytes of data from just human genome, but then you got your protein expression. It's more data, right? So you need huge amounts of this. And then we have like tens of cells. I think it's around 47 genes in our body. All these things can be expressed at different levels, and each cell has different stuff. So you can see huge amounts of data you have. And in human history, we couldn't have the tools or software. And even, let's say, 20 years ago, we wouldn't just have the databases and storage to store that much. But now we're starting to have it. Now we're starting to have AI tools. Now we're seeing that incredible feats like in AI where, you can synthesize an image of a human. Well, the same kind of tooling is applied to this data. You can get real insights. So for me, that's what makes me want to be in this technology right now, is that I feel like I don't know how much of a dent we'll honestly make in aging. Like, I think we'll make good dent in our lifetime. Just in terms of healthy lifespan, probably add 10, 20 average years to human. I don't really know. But the point is, we'll make huge amount of progress in science, and it's exciting, and our lives will be better. So this combination of the kind of software tooling and kind of biochemical basic understanding coming together is what inspires me to be here.
Wonderful, wonderful. And continuing along those lines, I look at Formic. It's your fund, and as you mentioned, you're talking about Aubrey. Obviously, you're a supporter of the Sense Foundation, but you also have some portfolio companies that are spin-offs from there. But then you're also invested in a sort of a broader range than Sense. I mean, you're in Turn Bio, which is much more complex, sort of reprogramming, in-silico's in there. So with the AI, Elevian, I think more sort of traditional drug development. Just talk about Formic, talk about what was like setting up the fund, and then a little bit of, obviously you have a lot of investments in there. What excites you the most? What are some things you're learning about being a longevity biotech VC compared to sort of your other VC-ish experiences with the software business? Take us on that little journey, if you would.
Well, I think in terms of Formic, I've started investing in some of these companies originally, but I was very cautious. I figured I'll need a few years to kind of learn the ropes because it's a very complex field. And then eventually, as I started learning science, I met more good people. I saw the projects I like. So I've decided to sort of formalize and define Formic Ventures as kind of a brand. And we brought a really talented researcher, Maria, actually on board recently, who has a PhD in biology and aging. So it's a joy to work with her. I have, a good friend of mine who's also joined me. So kind of building an organization. So we really kind of can get more organized and structured, both about research we do, some about investing. And in terms of the fund, I'm kind of in a lucky state where kind of coming from the history of building a startup,
Sure.
I don't need to do as much fundraising. So I can use a lot of frankly, now cash from the earlier companies to fund endeavors, and the great thing about that is actually means that we probably can be a little bit more mission oriented.
Sure.
So yes, on one hand, we, like anyone else, I would invest in things which you hope can have a good financial outcome, but also I like to really focus on initiatives which are likely to make an impact and move the field forward, even if the risk is higher than, I would say, typical VC would take. Sure. And what the risk means, you don't know what the outcome is, and there's a big chance that it will fail, let's say. And sometimes I can make a bet on something because I think the technology they're researching, it has just such big potential, or if it works. And there's always an if, and there's also when and who, right? But the kind of fund structure, I thought about, well, what can make the biggest impact? First of all, there is longevity, kind of the areas where we think we can kind of go after aging pathways, and sometimes maybe make a drug or a therapy which would prolong healthier lifespan. And we have some ideas about what those are in science, but it's not always clear. So that part of it looks a little bit more like supporting classic drug development or therapy development, but focused on aging areas. But the second part, which I care a lot about it, is tooling. And this is the idea that for us to make the most progress, we want to accelerate the research in science. How quickly do you know how well do you know how cells work? What changes as you age? And then all the gene expression, the changes of epigenetics over time as you grow older. There's all these details that right now you can do very time-consuming and long experiments to learn about. And sometimes, one aspect of it, researchers can spend like a few years and with a small team. And there's a lot of these great labs which do research. And what I want to support is really what tooling can make this faster. Like, how can you iterate on certain processes? And one company which I didn't invest in, but the kind of companies I'm excited about is recently I was looking at Berkeley Lights. And what they do is actually have these microfluidic chips which have compartments and they can put cells in. And then they can really select which cell has grown. In their case, it can be used for immunology, for example. And they can see which cell has the right receptor to react with another cell, so that maybe it fights cancer. But the thing is, you have these colonies of cells and things, and you handle them in parallel. And then there is some computer control of how they're guided. And then you can extract them and you can sequence them. So you could see this whole automation process that sometimes a process which takes several months traditionally in a lab can be shrunk. And there's lots of other exciting companies, for example, stuff around single cell sequencing, like public, 10x genomics, whatever. I'm not in, well, actually I did, I shouldn't. I like Berkeley. I did actually invest a little bit in it. Sorry, I wasn't trying to pitch it, but it just came to my mind right now. But I'm not invested in 10x Genomics. I think it's a great company. But the point is, and it might be a bad investment bet, I don't know. But the point is, the technology which makes and accelerates science on these details is coming. And that's the type of thing we want to support. And of course, what I'm excited about is on the VC side, trying to find those teams when they're young. There's a few people who are working with and kind of make the next kind of tool, make the next maybe method for studying proteins or assays or whatever to actually advance the science. And my feeling is if this is done, is ultimately will help health and it will help longevity. So that's how these two themes come together.
And when you're out there, obviously you don't need to fundraise for the fund, but when you're out there and you're putting together a syndicate with other investors to fund 20 million into whatever, what kind of feedback are you getting from the traditional life science venture capital world on how hot they are on aging and longevity in general? Obviously, I've seen some of, you've been in syndicates with some other groups. I've seen. Tell us a little bit what you're out there. Say, hey, you call up your buddy at XVC. I said, I got a great longevity company. Are they more receptive than they were 5 years ago, you think? Are you beginning to see some good traction in sort of the traditional institutional investing world that this longevity thing is hot?
I think so. With that said, the field, it feels like still very small. Like it is a very tiny field. If you look at longevity, as for people who say they're like fund in longevity field, objectively, I think a long time ago it started with longevity fund. Now we have people from other industries like Jim Mellon or Sergey Young come in with like the Juvenescence company, which is a company, but it's kind of like a fund in the sense that has a number of different indications they're going after.
Right.
Then there is Longevity Vision fund with Sergey Young, who are also investing in this field. You can combine a few, but if I think of all the funds, it's probably a few $100 million, which is really not that much in a scheme of big major biotech. So, and the exciting thing is it's grown in a huge way. Like you compare where it was 5 years before to now, we actually have a lot of discussion and excitement. And people in kind of more, so on the other side of this, you have traditional biotech, which are people who ultimately have billions of dollars among money funds, and they would fund kind of more general bio programs, like startups, meaning like making a drug for cancer or something, like something which has a lot of money going into it. And what I see now is there's more excitement from these other funds to join and participate in aging kind of related areas, but it's still not at the level of them actually focusing on it very seriously. I think the challenge is, if you ask for, like, you have to first define what the aging company is. Like, if you're a longevity aging fund, which kind of companies do you invest in, right? And what happens is, one way to define it is you have a company whose purpose is to address some aging pathway or some, so if founders set out on a mission to do something about an aspect of aging. The thing is, once they start on that mission, eventually they have to make a therapy.
Sure.
So, and once they are making the therapy, they have to have an indication after which they will actually go towards the clinical trials. And that has to be usually something classical. So we can't, so FDA doesn't have a general definition of aging.
Right.
I think this, we're making some progress with TAME trial, which is this trial for metformin as a kind of to target aging.
Yep.
So some really good progress, but right now still you need to have an indication of disease you're going to correct with therapy. So what happens, all these companies get started, and at some point they have to really narrow down and focus on a compound of a few therapies which target existing diseases to actually go forward in the market to have a chance of making money. So that kind of speaks to the definition of who you invest in. Instead of choosing the companies which focus on a disease, we try to choose companies which target a more broader aging, with an understanding that aging is actually the cause of most diseases. So that understanding is growing and there's more interest, but that particular approach is still kind of, you know, I don't know if niche is the right word, but it's still is not mainstream.
Michael, what obviously with your background, so you've been studying longevity a lot, and you seem to have immersed yourself in biotech, and you could probably talk it as with the best of them. At the same time, you have your history before that. And there's been, a lot of activity lately. I forget exactly when last year, but the FDA approved, the first sort of video game as a digital therapeutic recently by Akili Interactive for attention deficit disorder. Just wonder, I wasn't able to delve too deep into your portfolio, but with your sort of software gaming history, are you looking at anything sort of the digital therapeutic world, whether that's straight digital stuff or even gaming therapeutics?
So first of all, I actually think I'm excited that these therapies are coming out. The first exposure of mine to this concept was when we were working in Oculus. And I believe there was a group which was making a treatment for lazy eye, which is essentially in VR, and you put on the headset, you can, because when you have lazy eye, your eyes kind of look slightly different direction, and your brain kind of focuses on one. Here with VR headset, you can really shift attention to make the other eye work. So that I've seen some really good treatments coming out based on that. And then there was a NeuroRacer game, which is actually by Akili Interactive. I think that was kind of the original game, which they showed had some really good benefits. So I believe that was focusing on multitasking. So it's for kind of either elderly or kids who have trouble maybe doing several things at once. The interesting fact, which I thought was fascinating, was that after playing the game, which trained them to do several things in the game, they were able to perform better in the real world. So that kind of got me really to believe in this field. So, and now clearly they have some real clinical data of improvement for ADHD. So I think our brain is very plastic. So I remember reading a book about neuroplasticity and how there was actually work which was done with people who had damage in the inner ear, so they couldn't walk well. And then they basically came up with this apparatus which had a gyroscope and stimulation under the tongue, where as you moved around, the person who couldn't walk, they could get trained to essentially walk with this hat, where they got signals related to their orientation. And this actually helped them get better. They learned to walk with this, and they learned to actually heal, which is remarkable. I wouldn't have expected that to happen, but I guess there must have been some aspects of the inner ear and how that worked, which still had some working, functioning cells. So by your brain giving this kind of correcting signal, and that together, they were able to kind of establish a new pathway. So this is a clear example of how you can, by providing right path, either visual for your brain or something, you can guide it to a better state. So I think there's definitely future in those therapies. I haven't, like, I'm very excited about it. I'm also interested about cognitive things. I think there's going to be interesting things in this area. I do personally tend to focus a bit more though on kind of the molecular low-level biotech more than the cognitive areas. So,
I'd like to go now in a direction of which I sort of mentioned this offline to you. About 6 months ago, you blogged about something, specifically on a fascinating analogy between what you used to see in the virtual reality world with something called positional tracking. And you mentioned this at the beginning, and how you have to correct for distortions and lags and all this stuff to make sure left and right are in the right place and so forth. And this is an extreme. It was such a prescient blog post you made, because this is one area that we actually just lost the godfather of positional identity and of cells, Lewis Wolpert. He died last week at 91. And this is sort of one of those unknown things still, that, why this is left and why this is right in the human body, or why my heart is here and not down in my leg, which is above the genes. There's all sorts of other things that go on in the human body in terms of membrane potentials and various forces of mechanotransduction and so forth that dictate what a human body ultimately looks like. It's not written in the genes in that context. I'm just interested, this was, I was something like last June, you blogged about this. Have you given any look at any of the firms, labs around the country that are working on sort of the biophysical tools where we can begin to learn how we nudge, as you say in this, from one state to another, whether they be bioelectric tools or other types of things that are being studied in this particular aspect of aging?
Well, the analogy you're referring to was the one which is related, kind of the virtual reality sensor fusion to operation of a cell, which is admittedly very crude. But what I liked, and the reason about it, the reason I wrote it, is that the actual sensor fusion had a somewhat simple set of inputs. Like we had accelerometer and gyroscope, and accelerometer tells you acceleration is you nudge an object left or right. That's how your phone kind of knows whether you turn it upside down or not. And then the gyroscope is the orientation in space. You combine these things together and you can sort of figure out which way you're pointing. And if you take acceleration and you combine it twice, you double integrate, you can sort of get a sense for a position. So if I had a mouse and I moved it in space, in theory, you could track the path. The problem is that you get so much error that after about a second or two, the result just flies away. So it basically accumulates more and more. So it's kind of correct. It's near term good, but long term just non-functioning. Mm. So we had to solve this problem in virtual reality. And the way we did it is we actually corrected it with external cameras. So you kind of figure out the position and you combine this smooth, precise path with corrections along the path. And it occurred to me that in our body, we have cells which have all these inputs, and they're like these integration mechanisms. They get thousands of different signals of different concentrations of things, and they internally have genes and programs which decide what to do. And you have these corrections on many levels. Like the most simple correction is, let's say in a biochemical pathway, if you get too much of some molecule, the enzymes which are producing it will slow down and stop so that you don't have as much of it. There's basically this short-term balancing state. But you also have higher level balancing state. Let's say senescence. Cellular senescence is an example of where a cell gets enough damage, maybe telomeres are too short, maybe something else happens, radiation, it could choose to go into the senescent state, but that's actually considered often a defense mechanism from becoming a cancerous state where you would proliferate. So senescent cell is an aspect of aging. We look at them as not good necessarily, but they are kind of this stopgap measure against something which could be worse. So there is a sort of like a checkpoint to correct for something. Mm-hmm. So our cells and our body integrates all these signals and has all these different programs which are correcting them for all the time. So something gets a little worse, it's adjustment. If something gets even more worse, then there's another system which compensates, and it keeps functioning and functioning and functioning until at some point when enough damage accumulates in different random places where something goes wrong. And there's not more enough. So we've evolved many mechanisms of different levels, but it goes, sadly, we all go. Sure. And the question to me is there, what are the correction mechanisms? If we could prevent some of these things, either on a cellular level from decaying or correcting them, or on the broader tissue level, if we can identify things we could improve, correct, then we can maybe stabilize this decline. So that's kind of a high-level analogy where you have some simple mechanism versus much more complicated one, but there's this similarity in how you could maintain it maybe.
It was, I just have to say, it was a beautiful analogy. Personally, when I read it, I was like, here's somebody that understands sort of, because you're mentioning those networks that, obviously we're studying the cell and we're studying this, but those networks between the different levels, I think, personally, I think that's where a lot of the excitement is going to be in the coming years. But as I said, it was a beautiful analogy. I take my hat off to you for making it.
Well, that's actually what I'm excited about. And that's why I talk about tools. Yeah. And for example, one of the companies we are invested in, Turn Bio, is they're essentially focused on epigenetic reprogramming. And what that is, essentially, you have your DNA, and that encodes many genes, but clearly every cell has a different identity. So your nerve cell is going to be different from your muscle cell and so on. And what the cell identity is guided by the epigenetics. So you have the methyl groups on the DNA, you have particular way it's folded, there's a whole histone structure, the 3D structure which happens in the cell, and that 3D structure from all these chemical groups really defines what it is. And there was an exciting development about 15 years ago when we discovered Yamanaka factors, which enabled this induced pluripotent cells, which is basically taking a cell from your body, you could take a skin cell and you could reprogram it by adding some factors to produce the actual a different kind of cell.
Right.
So the exciting thing is that we've actually learned since then that by taking some of these factors, applying them a little bit, we can take a cell and actually a more elderly cell and change some of its epigenetic state
Sure.
to a younger state. So you can actually take a cell which is a 60-year-old baby, turn it into a 40-year-old cell. Now, we can't do it very well on an organism level, but I mean, there's definitely research going on there. And there's a few David Sinclair is one person who works a lot on that. They have Life Biosciences, and he writes about it in his book. And Turn Bio is actually another company which has slightly different approach to a similar concept. They're using mRNA to reprogram, and see if we can have this type of reversal effect in certain areas. Dermatology is actually a good one to start. Can we make our skin or hair younger? It's not as much risk. You can apply it to the surface, and if we can get the basics of this science to actually work at scale without side effects, then this can be one of the aspects which can really help health span. So that's actually why I'm excited about this approach. I don't know to which level it will work, but it's an example of kind of our understanding, like basically of an industry we're learning about this epigenetic and how you could have investments in longevity in this area. But the other thing which I think is cool is, and I personally would love to have, is actually more tools which help you study this. Because even when we apply these factors right now, we don't know what actually happens. Like you get younger because this cell gets younger because some methyl states are closer to what they look like in younger. But how did that happen? What are the internal processes? Is there rules? Does something else go wrong? What else can we do? We don't understand all those details. We understand bits and pieces. So any kind of technology could look like individual cell or the signals, or maybe you have a tissue. How do we study signals between cells? So we can see, like you were talking about, how does the body grow? Well, there's a cell with some epigenetic state, right? And on the left side of it, let's say it's growing, dividing, one of them becomes slightly different than the other. And there's this sort of programmed effects and states and tissue that a niche that you're in on which side has an effect as to what the next state becomes, and it gradually changes according to a set of these epigenetic state changes between the cells as they go. And how do we learn this process? So we already know so much about genes. We already know lots of details, but we need to know more. So really, I think that's an opportunity. I think in this decade, we will understand so much more about this and uncover like the details. So the kind of companies that I like to support is the ones who would come up with mechanisms for really studying this kind of process. And it will help aging, it'll help diseases long-term, but in the beginning, it'll just help us understand how do we work and how does biology and everything works.
Yeah, it's an exciting time, and I'm extremely impressed by how much you've absorbed of this this area. It's pretty fascinating, and I take my hat off to you for that. Because a lot of people don't do the investigations into some of these areas like you were just mentioning. They're very important to have the full piece. Michael, what's next? Obviously, we're all locked down, but you going to be going to conferences? Any lectures you're going to be giving? What's happening in the next year for you?
Well, I'm excited to see people in person. I like to spend time in conferences. I feel like that's one of the better way to learn and meet people, and quite honestly, get excited about whatever it is you do. When you're separate, you're alone, you could like learn your science or tech, but it's not the same as really engaging.
Sure.
And I think one of the things, as you come from software background, it's actually an incredibly humbling experience to see how much we don't know about science. And so for me, I think there's like several stages, like young career, when you start out of college, you learn programming, like, oh my God, I can get anything done. Then you realize maybe so, but it takes a lot of people in the team to make something, of really smart people working together to make something which is significant and like and makes a difference. And then like working at Facebook, for example, you realize how many smart, talented people and different ideas there are, like when you're in a big organization. So like one thing which, as I worked through Oculus, I was incredibly humbled by having all these smart people who had ideas, and I just realized how much I didn't know. Well, in biology and aging science in this field, that's even more so. Like it's the depths, it's super deep,
Yep.
and it's there's like no bottom. You can look at the molecules and then you end up with like quantum physics and Schrodinger equation, and there's a bunch of we don't knows. You look at proteins and we have some idea about many of them, but then there's still so much we don't know. And then you kind of go at any level and there's huge kind of unknowns. And then there's smart people who know like some areas. So really progress in this field can come from all kinds of directions. So I think I'm excited to go to conferences and events because there's just, I don't know what discovery will come next. For example, I was super excited about the AlphaFold solution to the protein folding problem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's thinking about it, like you have a string of amino acids and which are produced and you don't know what shape they'll take place, and the shape creates their function. So before, computers could not predict that. So the only way we could study it was with crystallography, complicated methods.
Yep.
And now suddenly we are at a point which it can be predicted. So suddenly more of a function. You can see how next step would be to build how do these certain proteins interact together. So we made this significant step in our ability to understand and simulate biology. And to me, that's exciting. So I want to go to events to learn about these kind of projects and find people who work in them, and really partially to see potential investments, partially to learn, and just kind of take it in. And I'm also excited that maybe with past COVID, we will, like, it's really clear to me, like, we've been able to get these vaccines out somewhat soon. I wish it was much sooner than that. I mean, the vaccine existed like 1 month after, we actually knew of the virus, right? It took all this time when the trials. But the good thing about that, it was compressed, like compared to what a traditional vaccine would take. So I think there's a lot of people appreciate the importance of biotech. I think they will believe in science more. I think there's room for regulation to support more iteration and drug development. So there's good momentum we can get out of this on the positive side. So I'm hopeful that will materialize and help move the field forward.
Completely agree with you. Completely agree with you. It's a fascinating time, and Michael, what you're doing in championing this this new initiative and moving these forward is extremely important for all of us. And I just want to thank you for doing it. And I really wish you the best of luck with the portfolio. For everybody that's going to be listening to this episode on the podcast or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Michael Antonov, founder and CEO of the Michael Antonov Foundation and Formic Ventures, an early stage health and biotech investment firm focused on prolonging healthy human lifespan, improving human creativity. Michael, thank you for taking the time out to talk to us for a bit tonight. And thank you for, as I was saying, everything you're doing and helping move this area forward. And as we say on the show, thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow through what you're doing. It's been really a fun time listening to to your story.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.